The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Martha tightened her shawl around her shoulders, listening to the rhythmic creak of her brother's boots against the warped wooden floorboards. Thomas had been out drinking again. The way he swayed in the doorway, his dark eyes glazed with something between regret and fury, told her everything she needed to know. Lydia sat by the cold hearth, her fingers curled around the last tin cup they owned, cradling it as if it might hold warmth if she wished hard enough. She looked up at Martha, her expression quietly pleading. Thomas tossed a handful of crumpled bills onto the table. They fluttered down like dead leaves, the ink smudged with sweat. "Not enough," he muttered, his voice thick with whiskey and defeat. Martha took a slow breath. "Not enough for what?" "For buying time," he snapped, raking a hand through his unkempt hair. "You don't get it, do you? I owe men who don't take kindly to waiting." He turned toward the shelf, knocking over their mother's oil lamp in his clumsy grasp for the half-empty bottle of bourbon. "You promised us, Thomas," Lydia said softly, her voice carrying the weight of too many disappointments. "You said you'd stop gambling." He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut to the tension like a blade. "A man can't change what he is." He spun to face them, the bottle dangling from his fingers. "And I can't be spending my days feeding and sheltering two useless mouths while the wolves are at my door." Martha felt her jaw tighten. "We're your family." Thomas slammed the bottle onto the table, the crack of glass against what made Lydia flinch. "Family?" He stepped closer, his breath hot with liquor. "Family don't hold a man back. Family don't eat while he starves." Martha didn't move. She had spent too many years waiting for Thomas to be the boy she remembered. The brother who had once carried her home when she'd scraped her knees, who had whispered stories to Lydia during storms. That boy was gone, drowned beneath whiskey and debt. "We'll leave," she said at last. Lydia turned to her, eyes wide. "Martha, what choice do we have?" she murmured, touching her sister's wrist. Thomas grunted. "Smart girl." He yanked open the drawer by the door and pulled out their mother's locket, the only thing of value they had left. Martha lunged for it, but he shoved her back. "No." Her voice was steel, but it did nothing to stop him from stuffing the locket into his pocket. "You owe me," he said. Then he grabbed Martha by the collar of her dress and dragged her toward the door. Lydia shrieked, tried to pull Martha free, but Thomas was stronger, angrier. He threw the door open and shoved them both outside. The night air was bitterly cold, the wind kicking up dust that stung Martha's eyes. She landed hard on the packed earth, Lydia stumbling beside her. Thomas stood above them, silhouetted against the dim glow from inside the cabin. "You walk far enough, you'll find some town willing to take you in." His voice was as careless as if he were sending away stray dogs. "Or maybe you won't. Either way, it's no longer my problem." Then the door slammed shut, and they were alone. Martha didn't move at first, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could hear Lydia's uneven breathing, could feel the way her sister clutched at her arm as if to anchor herself to something solid. She exhaled sharply and got to her feet, dusting off her skirts. "We have to go." Lydia hesitated. "Maybe he'll change his mind in the morning." Martha shook her head. "He won't." They had no food, no horse, no clear idea of where to go. But standing still wasn't an option, so they walked. The land stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving, painted in silver under the half-moon. The dirt was hard beneath their feet, and the night air turned colder with each passing mile. Lydia's hands trembled as she held onto Martha's arm, and every so often Martha could feel her faltering steps. "We should rest," Lydia whispered after what felt like hours. Martha scanned the open terrain. There was nothing but dry earth and scattered mesquite trees. A ridge rose in the distance, somewhere they could find cover from the wind. She nodded and led Lydia toward it. They settled beneath an outcrop of stone, curling into themselves for warmth. Martha could feel Lydia's shivers even as she tried to reassure her with a steady presence. "We'll find a way," she murmured. Lydia nodded, but her silence spoke of doubt. The night stretched long, filled with the distant cries of coyotes and the rustling of unseen creatures. Martha didn't sleep. She watched the stars instead, tracing familiar constellations the way their father had once taught them. Morning came in shades of gold and pink, painting the land in fragile beauty that mocked their desperation. Their feet ached as they walked, their stomachs gnawing with hunger. By midday, the sun burned mercilessly overhead, and Lydia's lips had cracked from thirst. Martha spotted a thin trickle of water snaking through a dry ravine, but before they could reach it, a sharp rattle stopped them in their tracks. A coiled snake lay in their path, its tail vibrating a warning. Lydia let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back, nearly falling. The snake hissed, poised to strike. Martha didn't think. She grabbed a rock and hurled it with all the strength she had left. The stone struck true, slamming against the serpent's head with a sickening crunch. Silence. Lydia was still breathing fast, clutching Martha's arms so tightly it hurt. "You all right?" Martha asked. Lydia nodded shakily. Martha turned away from the snake's lifeless form and pulled her sister toward the water. It wasn't much, just enough to dampen their parched throats. But it would have to be enough. By the time the sun began to sink, they had made little progress. Their exhaustion had slowed them, and Martha's ankle throbbed from twisting it earlier. A shadow passed over them, followed by the rhythmic sound of hooves. Martha's body tensed. The rider emerged from the horizon like an omen, his face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Another followed, then another. Bandits! Lydia gripped Martha's sleeve. "What do we do?" There was no running, no fighting. One of the men grinned as he reined in his horse. "Well, what do we have here?" Martha forced herself to stand tall. "We're just passing through." The man chuckled, nudging his horse closer. "That so? Looks to me like you ain't got much to pass through with." Lydia shrank behind Martha, but one of the others reached down and snatched her wrist. She yelped, trying to jerk free. Martha's pulse roared in her ears. She grabbed a rock, the only weapon she had, and swung hard, catching the man in the face. He cursed, staggering back. Then, without warning, a shot rang out. The bandit fell. The others barely had time to react before more gunfire cracked through the air. One by one, the outlaws tumbled from their saddles, their bodies hitting the dirt with dull thuds. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Martha's breath hitched as she turned, searching for their unseen savior. A figure stepped forward, half shadowed by the dying light. His face was unreadable, his stance wary. An Apache warrior. And he was watching them. 0 out of 2. Martha stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as the Apache warrior lowered his rifle. The dying light cast long shadows over his sharp features, his gaze assessing, unreadable. Around them, the bodies of the bandits lay still, dust settling over their lifeless forms. Lydia trembled beside her, fingers digging into Martha's sleeve. The warrior stepped forward. He moved with quiet confidence, his dark eyes flicking over them, lingering on the bruises along Lydia's wrist and the dirt smeared across Martha's face. More figures emerged from the twilight. 2 men, another younger, and a woman carrying a bow at her side. They surrounded the sisters, not menacing, but cautious, as if deciding what to make of them. Martha swallowed, forcing herself to stand tall despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse from thirst. The warrior studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and mounted his horse. The woman, fierce-eyed and sharp-boned, motioned for them to follow. Martha hesitated. They had nowhere else to go. She took Lydia's hand, squeezing it gently. "Come on." The journey was silent. The Apache moved with a quiet efficiency that made the sisters feel clumsy in comparison. The land stretched vast and endless around them, the horizon burning in hues of red and orange. Lydia staggered with each step, her body spent, but she kept moving. When they finally reached the camp, nestled in the natural curve of the canyon, the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat filled the air. A handful of people turned to look as they entered. Curious eyes, cautious stares. Children peeked out from behind their mothers, whispering in a language Martha did not understand. The warrior dismounted and gestured for them to stay. Then he disappeared into one of the larger lodges, leaving them standing in the growing chill of the evening. Lydia swayed beside her, barely upright. Before Martha could steady her, the fierce-eyed woman stepped forward and held out a water skin. Martha took it carefully, nodding in thanks before pressing it to Lydia's lips. She drank greedily, gasping as the water soothed her parched throat. The woman watched them for a moment, then spoke in measured English. "My father will decide what happens to you." Martha met her gaze. "And who is your father?" The woman lifted her chin. "Nantan." Martha had never heard the name before, but from the way others in the camp moved around the large lodge, she guessed it carried weight. She turned her attention back to the woman. "And you?" "Ishta." Before Martha could say more, the lodge's entrance parted and a tall man stepped out. His hair, streaked with silver, hung past his shoulders, and though age lined his face, his posture spoke of quiet strength. Nantan. His gaze moved over them, lingering on their ragged clothes, their tired faces. Then he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "You are lost." Martha nodded. "We were cast out." He studied her for a moment longer, then glanced toward Ishta. Something unspoken passed between them before he turned back to Martha. "You may stay for now," he said. Relief threatened to buckle her knees, but she forced herself to remain standing. She would not let them see her as weak. Lydia, however, had no such reservations. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Ishta turned on her heel and walked toward one of the smaller dwellings. "Come," she said without looking back. Martha and Lydia followed, their bodies aching with each step. Inside, the space was warm, lined with thick pelts and smelling of herbs Martha could not name. Ishta handed them blankets. "Rest. Tomorrow you will work." Martha nodded, too exhausted to argue. She barely remembered lying down before sleep dragged her under. By dawn, the camp was alive with movement. Martha awoke to the scent of cooking meat and the sound of voices outside. Lydia still slept, curled beneath the blanket, her face slack with exhaustion. Martha slipped outside, blinking against morning sun. Ishta stood by the fire, sharpening a blade. She barely looked up as she spoke. "Come." Martha followed her to the edge of the camp, where a young man stood beside a row of bows. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, his expression unreadable. "This is Cheno," Ishta said. "He will teach you." Martha crossed her arms. "Teach me what?" Cheno lifted a bow and held it out. Martha hesitated, then took it. The wood was smooth beneath her fingers, the weight unfamiliar. Cheno moved behind her, adjusting her stance with quick, efficient movements. Then he pointed toward a distant tree, where a crude target was marked. "Shoot." Martha exhaled sharply. "I've never used one before." "You will learn." She didn't like the way he said it, as if it were a fact rather than a possibility. Gritting her teeth, she raised the bow, pulled the string back, and let the arrow fly. It missed the tree entirely, disappearing into the brush. Cheno made a sound that might have been amusement. "Again." She shot him a glare, but obeyed. By the time the sun hung high, sweat dampened her back and her arms ached. But she was improving. Lydia, meanwhile, had been taken to gather herbs with an elder woman. When she returned, her hands were stained with crushed leaves, but her face was brighter than Martha had seen it in days. "They let me help?" Lydia said, a note of wonder in her voice. "They showed me what plants are used for healing." Martha glanced toward Ishta, who watched Lydia with a guarded expression. Then she looked toward Nantan, who stood near the fire, speaking with the elders. They were not prisoners here, but they were not truly welcome, either. That night, as they sat near the fire, Martha felt the weight of eyes on her. She turned to find Cheno watching her from across the flames. "You are strong," he said, his voice quiet. Martha met his gaze. "I have to be." Cheno nodded, as if he understood something unspoken. The air between them was thick with something unfamiliar, something that felt like understanding. For the first time since they had been cast out, Martha felt something other than fear. She felt the stirrings of a new kind of survival. The days in the Apache camp settled into a rhythm, one of work, sweat, and unspoken understanding. Martha had grown stronger, her hands rough on the bowstring, her muscles remembering the motion before her mind could correct them. Lydia, once delicate, now moved with quiet confidence, her fingers quick to sort herbs, her voice steady as she spoke to the elders in fragmented, careful words. They had found something like balance, something like belonging, but the past was never far behind. It came with the scent of whiskey on the wind. Martha was tending the fire when she heard the commotion at the edge of the camp. Horses, voices raised in anger, the unmistakable weight of something wrong pressing down on the air. She rose, hand drifting toward the knife Ishta had given her. The others sensed it too, the way Cheno stiffened beside her, the way the elders stood from their places, waiting. Then she saw him. Thomas. He was thinner than she remembered, his clothes hanging off his frame like they belonged to a man twice his size. His face was hollow, his skin grimed with sweat and dust. He swayed in his saddle, barely holding onto the reins of his stolen horse. Martha's stomach twisted. She should have felt nothing. He had left them, cast them out. But blood had a cruel way of binding itself in knots that no blade could sever. Thomas! Her voice was flat, cautious. His eyes found her, and for a fleeting moment, there was something almost human in them. Then he grinned, the same lazy, lopsided smirk that had once charmed shopkeepers and gamblers alike. Martha, he slurred. Well, ain't this a picture? His gaze flicked over her, then past her to the camp. Didn't take you long to cozy up with savages. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere behind her. Martha stepped forward before anyone could react. You need to leave, she said. Thomas laughed, but it was a dry, brittle sound. Not much of a welcome. His fingers twitched on the reins. Got myself in a bit of a situation, see. Some men are looking for me. Thought, maybe my dear sisters might help their poor brother out. Martha studied him, her stomach sinking. What did you do? Thomas scratched at his jaw, feigning thoughtfulness. Borrowed a bit from the wrong sort. Gamblers, bounty hunters. Hard to tell the difference these days. Point is, they'll be here soon, and I reckon you don't want them coming through this camp any more than I do. She felt the eyes of the Apache on her, waiting to see what she would do. Cheno stepped closer, his presence a steady weight beside her. Martha clenched her fists. You're not our problem anymore, Thomas. For a moment, just a flicker, something in his expression faltered. Then it was gone, replaced by anger. Oh, I see how it is. You'd rather throw in with them than your own kin. You threw us away first. Silence. Thomas swayed in the saddle. Then, almost too quietly, he said, I thought you'd be dead by now. The words landed like a slap. Martha exhaled slowly. You should have made sure. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He looked around, squinting at the warriors watching him. They'll kill me, won't they? She didn't answer. Thomas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Guess I deserve it. He turned his horse. I'll be out of your way soon enough. Then he rode off, disappearing into the twilight. But he did not take his troubles with him. The men he feared arrived with the dawn. They came like wolves, slipping to the landscape with the ease of men who had hunted before. 6 of them, lean and sharp-eyed, their hands never far from their holsters. The leader, a man with a face like dried leather, reined in his horse at the edge of the camp. He looked at Nantan, then at the others, taking his time. We're looking for a man, he said. His voice was slow, deliberate. Thomas Powell. Rode through here last night. No one spoke. The leader's eyes landed on Martha. You look like you know him. She forced herself to meet his gaze. We haven't seen him. A slow smile stretched across his face. That's so. He leaned forward. See, the thing about men like Thomas is they don't just disappear. They leave a mess wherever they go. His gaze shifted, scanning the camp. And I'd hate to have to turn this place upside down just to find him. A ripple of tension moved through the warriors. Cheno's hand drifted toward his knife. Martha felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. A choice had to be made. Then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, a gunshot cracked the air. A horse reared, its rider cursing. The leader turned, his expression darkening. There he is, one of the men muttered. Martha followed their gaze. A lone figure stood on the crest of the hill, rifle in hand. Thomas. Fool. The leader grinned. Well, look at that. He turned back to the camp. Appreciate your hospitality. Then he spurred his horse forward. The others followed, kicking up dust as they charged toward the ridge. Martha exhaled, tension still coiled in her chest. The Apache had not moved, but she could feel the weight of their stares. You should have let them take him, Ishta said. Martha swallowed. I know. Chenno watched the retreating figures, his jaw tight. They won't be satisfied with just him. Martha's throat went dry, because he was right. The past had come back, and it had brought hell with it. The first gunshot tore through the dawn like a crack of thunder. Then another. Martha barely had time to react before chaos swallowed the camp. The bounty hunters had turned their guns on Thomas, but Thomas, in his reckless desperation, had fired back. Now, they were all caught in the storm. Chenno shoved her aside as a bullet struck the ground where she had been standing. Lydia screamed, crouching behind the fire pit, her hands over her head. The Apache warriors moved with swift, brutal efficiency. Bows twanged, knives flashed in the early light. But the bounty hunters had come prepared, their revolvers spitting fire, their horses kicking up dust as they circled like vultures. Martha's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Thomas was still on the ridge, trying to reload with shaking hands. He was a fool, a damn drunken fool, and he had brought this upon them. A bounty hunter fell from his horse, an arrow lodged deep in his throat. Another slumped forward, clutching his side, but the others did not stop. Martha grabbed Lydia's hand and dragged her toward the shelter of a boulder. Stay down, she hissed. A shot rang out, too close. She turned just in time to see Chenno stagger, blood blooming across his shoulder. Rage burned through her. Without thinking, she darted forward, grabbing the fallen rifle from beside the fire. She had never fired one before, but there was no time for doubt. She raised the barrel, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her back, but the shot found its mark. A bounty hunter clutched his leg, howling in pain. Chenno gritted his teeth, pushing himself upright. Not bad, he muttered. She didn't have time to answer. Thomas had finally come down from the ridge, stumbling into the camp, his face pale with fear. They're going to kill me, he gasped. Martha turned on him, fury boiling over. You did this. Thomas opened his mouth, but another gunshot silenced him. He flinched, hands flying up in surrender. The leader of the bounty hunters sat astride his horse, his revolver still smoking. He wasn't smiling anymore. This don't concern you, lady, he said, his voice like gravel. Hand him over, and we'll be on our way. Martha's hands clenched into fists. She looked at Thomas, at the brother who betrayed them, abandoned them, and now brought death to their doorstep. But he was still her brother. Lydia's voice was small, broken. Martha? Torn. That was the only word for it. Torn between vengeance and blood, between justice and mercy. Thomas saw it in her face. His breath hitched. Please. She had never heard him beg before. The leader cocked his gun. Don't got all day. The wind howled through the canyon. Every eye was on her. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. Past Chenno, past Ishta, past the warriors who had taken her and Lydia in. She met the bounty hunter's eyes. Take him, she said. Thomas went rigid. Martha. Enough. Her voice was steel. You sealed your fate a long time ago. Something broke in his expression. He turned wild-eyed, looking for a way out. But there was none. The bounty hunter jerked his head toward one of his men. They grabbed Thomas by the collar, yanking him toward a waiting horse. He thrashed, but it was useless. Martha, he screamed as they hauled him into the saddle. You can't do this. She held his gaze, her chest tight. I already have. Then they rode away, dragging Thomas with them. Silence fell over the camp, thick and suffocating. The dust settled. The dead lay where they had fallen. Martha exhaled, a shuddering breath that left her hollow. Lydia was crying, silent tears slipping down her dirt-streaked face. Chenno watched her, his wound still bleeding, his face unreadable. Ishta was the one who spoke. You did what had to be done. Martha didn't know. if that was true. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she might collapse, but she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she turned to Nantan, the elder who had given them shelter, who had trusted them enough to let them stay. "If we're not welcome anymore," she said, "we'll leave." Nantan studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he shook his head. "You fought for us," he said simply. "That makes you one of us." Martha swallowed hard. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. Lydia sniffed, wiping at her face. "So we stay?" Ishta smirked. "For now." A beat passed. Then Martha turned, staring at the horizon where Thomas had disappeared. She had lost a brother today. But maybe, just maybe, she had gained something stronger. A family that would not betray her. A place where she could finally belong. She took a breath, the desert wind filling her lungs. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free.